Back in those days, the debate was always about what they called stakeholder capitalism versus shareholder capitalism. And this was whether a company should just serve the people who owned it, the people who had financial value in it, or they should serve all the people who they were accountable to. And eventually, that started to develop new ways where companies thought, we don't want to be regulated by all these national governments. It's a patchwork, we can't deal with it. Let's take some responsibility and actually try to make ourselves accountable in a way we can live with it. So really, it was globalization and the way that changed companies that gave them the vision, together with the nationalist backlash, that they had to establish a new basis for their legitimacy. And that's really how we started, I think, to get the emergence of global, diverse, public good providing organizations. Because these companies had gotten so used to being global, their identity was so global, that when there was this reaction to put all these regulations on them that would have undermined that, they decided to take the high road and to transform themselves into a range of flexible democratic institutions. And of course, once that was happening, they naturally wanted to look for other funding mechanisms, other ways that were not just relying on their shareholders, because otherwise they couldn't get the funding that they needed to thrive that way. So once you had this new type of corporation that had this democratic inclination, it sought these new funding mechanisms, and it needed the involvement of tax authorities in that.
So the SDR, it's nothing really new. The SDR has been around for since 1969. It's been there all the time, but most of the time it's been hidden from the public view, and even expert financial analysts hadn't even heard of the SDR. But of course, when the crisis in 2008 came, in 2009, they created more than 200 billion worth of SDR to solve the problems for some of the poorest countries. And then we said, maybe we should use the mechanism over again, but not just to solve financial crisis, but also the ecological crisis, the hunger crisis, the human rights crisis around the world. And now we see how the money was evolved from trying to save banks to trying to save the people. So like I said, it was always there. We just had to make some improvements, even with the existing international framework.
The really killer application was that because the euro crashed during the crisis, we needed to create a new type of crypto public money that was the e-euro, that was a mix of cryptography, so that the digital money, it was not like Libra, managed by Facebook, a surveillance system that could monitor all of us. We broke that, and the e-currency, the crypto e-currency, became a decentralized public money system that preserved the privacy of people, but also that enabled a series of complementary currencies to become the basic of a new complementary economies in every cities that remunerate positive, sustainable, cooperative economies.
Now, in 2038, I'm very happy to see that people have taken up this technology and have made it their own. They appropriated it and built their own currencies. I'm very happy to see that the IMF and the World Bank plan has failed. They thought that one currency dominated by one worldwide institution was a good idea, but we knew all the way that it wasn't. We worked to actually make people understand that a complementary currency system will be the future, because then you can have money that reflects the value of the community. And yes, cryptography can also be used to make money authenticated and circulate, and use phones to transfer it.
The thing is, now we have such a good level of technology that it would have been stupid not to apply different rules for different amounts of money and different types of economies, different priorities that any country has, you know. For example, in some of the countries that we have, they have a higher priority over early education, and others have a more priority over university education. And that's fine because the system is flexible and it allows for a yearly creation of new money with the SDRs allocated to the countries that need it the most. With the global SDR, with the electronic global SDR, what we have changed is a money system that used to work exclusively for profit of the banks, and now it is assigned for the public purpose to basically guarantee the rights of human beings.
It was precisely from this conflict between sort of the ultra-capitalism and globalization and the nationalist backlash that we started to see first the emergence of democratic accountability by these corporations to their global stakeholders, their workers, consumers, the people they did business with, and then how that drew up these experiments that we had been seeing in funding open source software, in crowd funding, into the mainstream. Because these companies, once they had this democratic principle, needed a funding model to go along with that.
So in this new world, we didn't just work less and sort of damage the environment less. We changed how people produced all the goods that we do need. We realised, and this was critical to changing how the economic system functioned. We realised that we now have the technology, so that instead of saying, look, we have to make one massive factory, employ tens of thousands of people there, churn out loads and loads of basically identical goods and flood the market like this, we realised that the technology we have now, 3D printing is the classic one, but these digital production technologies means that you can produce on a small scale. So you can produce customized goods. You can, well, if you're going to insulate everybody's house, you can do small-scale production of customized fittings for people's lofts. You could do this in a cost-effective way. And you could take that technology and give it to local communities and actually have them take ownership of it. So instead of one giant company owning the technology and, generally speaking, a few people at the top getting all the wealth from that, you take the wealth and you put it back in the hands of the people who actually produce the wealth, and you do it on a small scale. So suddenly, there was a renaissance of manufacturing, of small-scale manufacturing across Europe, that instead of vast factories, you had community-owned 3D printing, you had people retraining on how to fix and repair and start to make the circular economy function. So that instead of having electronic doohickeys that collapsed and fell apart after 2 years, people would learn how to repair and fix them. So you had a flourishing of creativity, and it was owned and controlled and managed from below, from people on the ground, from local communities, getting together and actually taking ownership of the technology themselves.
Now we have in place this network of complementary currency systems, which are decentralized, managed at a city level, and then on top of that we have this crypto digital public money that enables, citizens to really take back the control also of the economic life. So this was absolutely, the plan of Decode to enable these data commons, but we didn't imagine that we were able also to encode not only privacy as a right, but also economic freedom and economic justice as a right, due to this kind of new monetary systems that we were able to implement.
From 2031, the private property is no longer a viable condition for whatever has to happen to keep things going, both in terms of the human social system, which used to be dominated by the market and accumulation, but also in terms of the environment, because it's clear that the environmental destruction has happened because of the consequences of the privatization of wealth, property accumulation, and so on. It's not yet clear to us what needs to happen to take its place. We're still constructing that, and there are many arguments about what to do. But there's a kind of negative criteria, which is like private property cannot continue as the basis of social system. Which also means, I think, one of the political struggle that we have now is that we don't know what the basis for social condition is if it's not liberalism. Liberalism being the political formation with private property as a premise. Yeah, so the 1%, or the less than 1% who accumulated most of the planet's wealth, that's the problem. That can't continue. The 5% of people who resist or refuse or kind of, but in a way, if their levels of accumulation and destructive contribution to planetary ecologies are insignificant, of course they can continue doing what they want. They don't fall within the kind of the mechanisms that need regulation. So I think one of the key interests in the post-23 moment is the point around distribution. One of the key elements of post-23 is that the distributed model allows for many different types of practice, but the integration of those practices, or kind of how they combine and aggregate into an overall system which doesn't produce toxic results, both in terms of distribution of wealth or distribution of capital, but also in terms of environmental consequences. That's where the regulatory mechanisms are really significant. And so the one thing that can't be countenanced is the perpetuation of massive degrees of hyperaccumulation by a very small percentage of the population with very toxic results, socially and environmentally.
You know, eventually, once people moved beyond this blockage of being obsessed with everything being private property, so many different things started to flourish, and the combinations we got were really amazing, because you could have a company that partially owns things, and then a community that partially owns things, and different people would have different ability to claim the use of things, and not just having those systems be traditional informal systems that evolved in indigenous communities or pre-capitalist, but actually to have a computer-facilitated, market-oriented, efficient system for having these partial common ownership, I think just kind of blew open the space and opened the way for all the innovation we see today in ways of getting access to and using assets.